That doesn't mean that your nervous system is the only existing reality and that there is nothing beyond your nervous system. But it does mean that all knowledge is knowledge of you, and that therefore in some mysterious way you are not different from the external world that you know. If you see that what you experience and you are the same thing, then realize also, going back to that you are in the external world for the people. You see, I'm in your external world, you are in my external world.
I didn't do that.
But I'm in the same world you are.
Wait, that.
My inside is not separable from the outside world. It's something the so-called outside world is doing. Just as it's doing the tree and the ocean and everything else that is in the outside world. Now, isn't that great, you see? We've completely got rid of the person in the trap. The one who either dominates the world or suffers under it. It's vanished. It never was there. And when that happens, you see, you can play any life game you want to. Link the past and the present and the future together. Play roles. But you know, you've seen through this great, what do they call it, the great social lie, that one accumulates, owns experiences, memories, sights, sounds, and from that, other people, possessions, so on. So building up always this idea of oneself as the haver of all this. If you think that, you've been had. During the last two sessions, I've been talking to you principally about the philosophy of the Lao Tzu book, the Tao Te Ching, and now I want to shift today over to Zhuangzi. This Zhuangzi, so far as we know, lived about 300 BC, maybe a little earlier than that. And he is a very, very remarkable person because the Zhuangzi book, he's also, more exactly, his name is Zhuangzhu, but his book, sometimes called simply the Zhuangzi book, is quite unique in the whole history of philosophy. Because he's almost the only philosopher from the whole of antiquity who has real humor. And therefore he's an immensely encouraging person to read. But part of his humor is the art of exaggeration. And you always have to allow for that. You always have to realize that he's slightly pulling his own leg. He is, as in a group of people who are enthusiasts for something but have humor, you very often find that when they're talking among themselves, they carry their own ideas to ludicrous extremes and roar with laughter about it. And Zhuangzi does that. Now, for example, he has a great deal to say about the value of the useless life. The whole notion of something of life, any moment in life or any event in life being useful, that is to say, serving the end of some future event in life, is to a Taoist absurd. Because nothing is useful at all. The universe is viewed as purposeless and useless through and through, because it's a game. But more than that, a game doesn't really convey the sense of this. When a Taoist sage is wandering through the forest, he isn't going anywhere. He's just wandering. When he watches the clouds, he loves them because they have no special destination. He watches birds moving around. He watches the waves lapping on the shore. And just because all this does not best end when it is, because it serves no end other than being what it is now, it is for that reason that he admires it. And it is for that reason that you get the peculiar styles of Chinese painting in the Tang, Song, and later dynasties, where nature, in its wayward, wandering nature, is the main subject. When we say that something is without purpose, that's a put-down phrase. We say, well, there's no future in it. What's the use? And we need very much to realize that that question reflects our insanity. What's the future? What's the use? joy for the Taoist is that things have no use, and the future is not important. Now you can exaggerate this, and Zhuangzi does in a very humorous way, by describing the ideal useless man. He's a hunchback, and he's so deformed that his chin rests on his navel, and so on. But he says now this man is very admirable. He's found the secret of life because when the social service workers come around, he's the first to get a free handout. And when the military officers come around to conscript people for the army, he's the first to be rejected. Therefore, he lives long. Some travelers came across an enormous tree. Fantastic thing. And they said, never did anyone see such a tree. So they went up and looked at it. At first they tested the leaves and found that they were rough and disagreeable and no good to eat. Then they looked at the branches and found that they were all twisted and absolutely no good for using as sticks. Then they examined the wood and found it was full of pith and absolutely useless for a carpenter. So nobody had disturbed this tree. It was not used for cutting down or any purpose whatsoever. And so it grew to an enormous size and was of great age. Zhuangzi is here pulling our legs. He is not exactly asking us to take all that literally, but this is his way of doing things. Then also he describes the behavior of the high form of man. And he says, the man of character lives at home without exercising his mind and performs actions without worry. The notions of right and wrong and the praise and blame of others do not disturb him. When within the four seas all people can enjoy themselves, that is happiness for him. When all people are well provided, there is peace for him. Sorrowful in countenance, he looks like a baby who has lost its mother. Appearing stupid, he goes about like one who has lost his way. He has plenty of money to spend and does not know where it comes from. He drinks and eats just enough and does not know where the food comes from. This is the demeanor of the man of character. Then by contrast, the hypocrites are those people who regard as good whatever the world acclaims as good, and regard as right whatever the world acclaims as right.
This song is called
When you tell them that they are men of Tao, then their countenances change with satisfaction. When you call them hypocrites, then they look displeased. All their lives they call themselves men of Tao, and all their lives they remain hypocrites. They tell appropriate anecdotes in order to attract the crowd. But from the very beginning to the very end, they do not know what it's all about. They put on the proper garb and dress in the proper colors and put on a decorous appearance in order to make themselves popular, but refuse to admit that they're hypocrites. But this explanation of the man who is stupid in countenance and appearance and is wandering about as if he lost his way, doesn't know anything. Of course, it's based on the text in Lao Tzu where he says, the people of the world are merrymaking as if partaking of the sacrificial feasts, as if mounting the terrace in spring. I alone am mild, like one unemployed, like a newborn babe that cannot yet smile, unattached like one without home. The people of the world have enough to spare, but I am like one left out. My heart must be that of a fool, being muddled, nebulous. The vulgar are knowing, luminous, I alone am dull, confused. The vulgar are clever, self-assured, I alone depressed. Patient as the sea, adrift, seemingly aimless. The people of the world all have a purpose. I alone appear stubborn and uncouth. I alone differ from the other people, and value drawing sustenance from the mother. Capital M, that's Mother Nature. So, there is about, you see, the character of the Taoist sage as depicted by Zhuangzi, something of the fool. Because the fool is a person who doesn't know enough to come out of the rain, who doesn't compete. Everybody else gets before him to the prizes, the material prizes of life, and even to the spiritual prizes. The fool is, you see, the person who isn't going today, who isn't interested in survival. He remains the most wonderfully friendly, swinging kind of a cat, but he has no ambition. He doesn't fight for himself, and nobody can ever get him to. So the fool has always been used as a kind of analog of the sage. There's a Hindu verse which says, sometimes naked, sometimes mad. Now as a scholar, now as a fool. Thus they appear on earth, the free men. And if you read the biographies in the early life of Sri Ramakrishna or Sri Ramana Maharshi, they are absolutely wild. Now, not all of this, you see, again, just as in reading Zhuangzi, you mustn't take it too literally. These things are said by way of a kind of overstress to correct another kind of overstress in the opposite direction. When a Japanese scholar many years ago explained the teaching of Buddhism to me, he said something I had never heard anybody else say, that the Buddha taught, for example, that life is suffering. In order to correct the the wrong view that it ought to be pleasure. He said that everything is impermanent in order to correct the wrong view that reality lasts forever in time. So the idea of the middle way is set up in this fashion, by going to one extreme in order to correct another. This is a very common Asian technique, and it is found especially in Zen, where teachers, when they are asked about something sacred, will always answer in terms of something secular. What is the Buddha? The tree in the garden. Then when you ask about something secular, they answer in terms of something sacred. You see? As there's a master and his student working in the field, and they are using a knife to prune, and the student suddenly says to the master, "Give me the knife." And he gives it to him point first. And so he says, "But please let me have the other end." The teacher says, "What would you do with the other end?" See, the question immediately turns into a kind of a metaphysical thing. So this play back and forth between the extremes has as its interior design the awakening of the mind to polarity, this thing of mutual arising. Zhuangzi tells a story about this. He says a certain keeper of monkeys said with regard to their ration of nuts that each monkey should have 3 in the morning and 4 at night. But at this the monkeys were very angry. So the keeper said they might have 4 in the morning and 3 at night, with which arrangement they were all well pleased. Now the number of nuts was the same, he goes on to say, but there was an adaptation to the likes and dislikes of those concerned. This then, he says, is the way of conduct of the sage. Basically, Zhuangzi's philosophy is a philosophy of relativity. There is no absolute standard of great or small, of important or unimportant. There is a story, for example, of a sort of enfant terrible at a banquet, and the speeches are being made after dinner. And somebody gets up and says that the human being is the highest of all creatures, that the whole world serves humanity. And there's a lot of pompous nonsense. The small boy gets up and says that since tigers feed on human beings, it's quite obvious, therefore, that human beings exist for the service of tigers. For Zhuangzi, you must get the point of view that small things are as big things can be, and big things are as small things can be. Everything can be looked at as great or small, important and unimportant, and all the steps between. Because his conception of the world is essentially cyclic. Taoist and Zen teachers have a whole method of teaching by circles and drawing circles. The center of a circle is any point on the circumference. You can begin anywhere. Where do you stop? The circle of life, the cycle of life, the interdependence of the bees and the flowers, the interdependence of long and short, you see, it's all circular. And so there is nowhere and there is everywhere that it can begin. In the same way, when he discusses the organs of the body, he makes a catalogue of all these organs and says, now which do you prefer? It says which one comes first and which one follows, which one rules and which ones are servants. He said it seems that there may be a governor in all this, but nobody could ever find it. There is this expression, Tianran, which has almost the same meaning as Ziran, spontaneity, of itself so. This means something is so through the power of heaven. Now heaven, Tian, means simply the universe. As you look out from Earth, which is, as it were, the center or the base, everything else, the whole expanse of the cosmos, is Tian, heaven. And there is no connection in the idea of heaven with some sort of personal ruler of the universe. So the notion of God, you see, as we understand it, is really very foreign indeed to Taoist thought. And when you see somebody translating this as God, it gives a very wrong impression of this teaching. For example, there is a passage in which Shun asked Zheng, saying, can one get the Tao so as to have it for one's own? And the sage answers, your body is not your own. It is the delegated image of Tian. And, missionaries translate God, because they've read in the Bible, man is made in the image of God. Your life is not your own. It is the delegated adaptability of heaven. Your offspring are not your own. They are the delegated seeds of heaven. You move, you know not how. You are at rest, you know not why. These are the operations of the ways of Tao, in accord with the spontaneous rhythm of the universe. That's really what it means. There isn't even an idea in Chinese thought of the law of nature as we have it. See, the motions of the body, the harmony of the organism, is not what it is in obedience to a law. The Chinese do have an idea of law. This is the word Zi. This is a drawing of a sacrificial iron cauldron with a knife beside it. And it comes from a time when the laws were inscribed on the sacrificial cauldrons, so that when people came to offer their sacrifices, they would read the laws. The certain sages objected to this and said that if the people know what the laws are in the fixed terms of writing, they will develop a litigious spirit. That is to say, they'll start haggling about what it really says. And as you know, that is the principal occupation of lawyers. And he said that the thing is that you mustn't write it down like that. And so the Tao is described as Wuzi. We would translate literally lawless. But it means, of course, transcending this kind of law, which is specific law. Positive law, I think, is the correct legal term. So there's no notion in the Taoist philosophy of the world as responding to a boss. So the body does not have in it a ruling organ. Its order is the consequence of, or the operation of, every part of it existing together simultaneously, arising mutually. There's no Now, the difficulty, you see, in Zhuangzi's philosophy, the difficulty with human beings is they begin to think in terms of governing and ruling. And they set out to dominate themselves and their surroundings. And invariably, this leads to a mess. So, the whole principle, then, is one of success in life through not pushing it around, through not trying to govern it.
That's why it says in the
He tells a story, as a matter of fact, Zhuangzi has a very funny trick. A lot of his wisdom he puts in the mouth of Confucius. He said that Confucius was one day doing this, and he ran into Lao Tzu, and they had an argument, and Lao Tzu won. But then the next time he talks about Confucius teaching Lao Tzu's doctrines. And this to the immense confusion of everybody. But it said one day Confucius was standing by a river where there was a tremendous cataract plunging down. And he suddenly saw an old man coming out of the forest who fell into the river and suddenly disappeared into the cataract. And he said, "Oh dear, too bad. Probably some old fellow tired of life will want to put an end to it all." The next moment, way downstream, the old man gets out of the water and starts bouncing along. And Confucius is amazed, and he sends one of his disciples to catch this fellow before he disappears. He said, "Sir, I was thinking that you were going to commit suicide, and I suddenly find that you came out of that cataract alive. Do you have some special method by which you do this?" "No, I have no special method," said the old man. "I just go in with the whirl and come out with the swell. Because I don't resist the water, I entirely identify myself with water." So you see, here he is, utterly relaxed, just rolling around in the torrent and not resisting in any way. And so he's preserved. He goes with the stream, rolls with the punch, or whatever you want to call it. Again, of course, there is exaggeration in a story of this kind. Just as there's exaggeration in the story of the hunchback and the tree and so on. Because true wu-wei, or letting go, non-interference, it doesn't mean, for example, flabbiness. A lot of people, when they think they're relaxing, merely become flabby. And if that is so, you know, the perfectly relaxed person would slowly become jello and would spread out on the floor and finally drip through into the basement. Relaxation, you see, is simply something that happens when there's too much yang in you, too much for the positive. You need to balance off to the yin. And the trouble is that human beings, in their anxiety to control things, exhibit too much yang, too much aggressiveness, too much of the male principle. They need the balance of the female. So all these exaggerations in the direction of let things go, let things happen, don't interfere, are stressing the yin point of view to compensate for the excess of yang. I remember reading a book called You Must Relax. The difficulty always arises when one feels I must relax, I must let go, and let things happen. How on earth do I do it? Even in trying to relax, I'm all tense because I'm anxious that it must happen, and maybe it won't. And how do you do it? You see, you can't achieve Wu Wei like that. What you have to understand is that you don't have to do anything. There's no method, as the old man said. The meaning of Wu Tse, when he thought that Tao is Wu Tse, or lawless, it means there is no method in it. It's all based on understanding, or what our psychologists call insight. You have to find out that there is nothing that you do as a source and cause of action separate from everything else. When you know that there is no separate acting you, then there is no need to try to relax. The thing you have to see is that the flow of the Tao, as I said yesterday with the illustration of the people swimming in a strong stream, that the flow of the Tao goes on anyway. Just like the flow of time, for example, you can't get out of the present moment. You can think about the past, and you can think about the future. But since you do that thinking now, the present is inescapable. All right, now the present moment, it has a sense of flow. Time is going along, life is going along. Time, actually, the clock time is simply a measure of flow, a way of going tick, 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 and counting the ticks. And say, well, we've lived through so many ticks. But nevertheless, the real time, as distinct from this ticking thing, is a flowing. And yet it's still. Isn't that fascinating? It moves, but you're always there. It's always now. You never get out of now. All right, now if you can feel that, see, that you can't get out of now, and you never will. See? Now, realize that what we call now is the same thing as Tao. The Tao, the cause of things, the eternal now, the presence of God, anything you want to call it. See? That's now, and you can't get out of it. So there's no need to get with it, because you can't get out. See? That's beautiful. You just relax, and you're there. So that's the principle of flowing. You can make all kinds of very clever ways of postponing finding this out. It's terribly simple. But you can say, well, this is a very spiritual matter, and I'm an unevolved person, and it'll take me a great deal of time to realize this in a more than an intellectual way. That's an excuse for playing your own game and not finding this out. There are all sorts of elaborate ways of doing that, and you can put it off by indulging in the most complicated systems of spiritual culture and yoga and so on and so forth. And that's all right. I have no objection to your putting it off if that's what you want to do. But actually, it's always here and now. Just as you can't get away from now, you can't get out of the Tao. That's the humor of the whole thing. And that's why Zhuangzi has this beautiful light touch. He says, the heron is white without a daily bath. The crow is black without being painted in ink. And this is the same saying, as in Zen. In the spring landscape, there is nothing superior, nothing inferior. Flowering branches grow naturally, some short, some long. Or they say a long thing is the long body of Buddha. A short thing is the short body of Buddha. Zhuangzi has this to say about it. Those who say that they would have right without its correlate wrong, or good government without its correlate misrule, do not apprehend the great principles of the universe, nor the nature of all creation. One might as well talk of the existence of heaven without that of earth, or of the negative principle, yin, without the positive, yang, which is clearly impossible. Yet people keep on discussing it without stop. Such people must be either fools or knaves. Of course, one could always reply to Zhuangzi that there have to be fools and knaves, so that we can recognize the existence of sages. Speech is not mere blowing of breath. It is intended to say something. Only what it is intended to say cannot yet be determined. Is there speech indeed, or is there not? Can we or can we not distinguish it from the chirping of young birds? How can Tao be so obscured that there should be a distinction of true and false? How can speech be so obscured that there should be a distinction of right and wrong? Where can you go and find Tao not to exist? The Tao is obscured by our inadequate understanding, and words are obscured by flowery expressions. There is nothing which is not this. There is nothing which is not that. What cannot be seen by that, the other person, can be known by myself. Hence I say, this emanates from that. That also derives from this. This is the theory of the interdependence of this and that. Nevertheless, life arises from death and vice versa. Possibility arises from impossibility and vice versa. Affirmation is based upon denial and vice versa. Which being the case, the true sage rejects all distinctions and takes his refuge in heaven. That's in the universe. For one may base it on this, if this is also that and that is also this. This also has its right and wrong and that has its right and wrong. Does then the distinction between this and that really exist or not? When this, the subjective, and that, the objective, are both without their correlates, that is the very axis of Tao. And when that axis passes through the center at which all infinities converge, affirmations and denials alike blend into the infinite one. See, the axis of the opposites is the perception of their polarity. The difference between them is explicit, but the unity of them is implicit. The difference, the explicit difference between two ends of a stick, but the implicit unity that they are ends of the same stick, you see? So that's the axis. The axis of Tao is the, you might call it the secret conspiracy, that it lies between all poles and all opposites, which is implicit, esoteric, or whatever you want to call it.
I mean, some compare the golem now to ChatGPT.
So that unity, whether it's between you and the
some
universe, or whatever you want to take, is not something that has to be brought into being. If one brings it into being, one assumes that it doesn't exist. That's called in Zen putting legs on a snake, or a beard on a eunuch. There's something unnecessary, you see. So it exists, it is always there, and you can see it so vividly. And actually almost put your finger on it and sense it, if you understand that the movement of the Tao is exactly the same thing as the present moment. Now, of course, if you try to grab the present moment, and get ready with your clapper, and say, now! It's gone. The finer and finer you draw the hairline on the watch, you don't know exactly when now is, you eventually get to the point where you can't see it at all. But if you leave it alone, you don't try to grab the moment as it flies. But it's always there. See, you don't have to mark it. You don't have to put your finger on it. Because it's everything that there is. And so the present moment suddenly expands. And it contains the whole time, all past, all future, everything. You never have to hold on to it. It's gone. The finer and finer you draw the hairline on the watch, you don't know exactly when now is, you eventually get to the point where you can't see it at all. But if you leave it alone, and you don't try to grab the moment as it flies, but it's always there. See, you don't have to mark it. You don't have to put your finger on it. Because it's everything that there is. And so the present moment suddenly expands. And it contains the whole time, all past, all future, everything. You never have to hold on to it. And get ready with your clapper and say, now! It's gone. The finer and finer you draw the hairline on the watch, you don't know exactly when now is, you eventually get to the point where you can't see it at all. But if you leave it alone, and you don't try to grab the moment as it flies, but it's always there. See, you don't have to mark it. You don't have to put your finger on it. Because it's everything that there is. And so the present moment suddenly expands. And it contains the whole time, all past, all future, everything. You never have to hold on to it. And say, now! It's gone. The finer and finer you draw the hairline on the watch, you don't know exactly when now is, you eventually get to the point where you can't see it at all. But if you leave it alone, and you don't try to grab the moment as it flies, but it's always there. See, you don't have to mark it. You don't have to put your finger on it. Because it's everything that there is. And so the present moment suddenly expands. And it contains the whole time, all past, all future, everything. You never have to hold on to it. exactly when now is, you eventually get to the point where you can't see it at all. But if you leave it alone, and you don't try to grab the moment as it flies, well, it's always there. See, you don't have to mark it. You don't have to put your finger on it. Because it's everything that there is. And so the present moment suddenly expands. And it contains the whole of time, all past, all future, everything. You never have to hold on to it.
Okay, the name of that video is Alan Watts Dropping Out from Karma, Being in the Way podcast, episode 2. This is on the Be Here Now network. 200,000 subscribers. Okay, we're going to jump into another Alan Watts video. It's called On Being God, Being in the Way. But first, an advertisement from LinkedIn.
If you own a car, this video's for you. If you don't own a car,
TikTok is still advertising, but they're about to get deleted from the App Store?
Well, now, if you listened to George Leonard last night, George Leonard explained how children were befuddled by being taught to ask why about everything. Because you always look away from what you're asking about to its antecedents, and that won't lead you anywhere at all. Why am I here? And I answer that question. Then somebody says, well, why that? And then somebody says, well, why that? Why that? Why that? And you get back and back and back, and eventually you get tired of answering. And so fathers, when their children say, why, Daddy? Why? They say, oh, shut up and eat your lollipop. But what happens, you see, when we trace the causation of things into the past, it all begins to fade out in silence and no answer. Why? Because it didn't begin there. The universe begins now. It didn't begin in the past. And the past trails back from now like the wake of a ship. If everything If everything is God and there is no time except now, what is the role of chance? Chance pairs with order. You'll say randomness with God, and it pairs with order. And it is part of the nature of order. If you know what you mean by order, you know that you mean contrast with randomness. And if you know what you mean by randomness, you know that you mean contrast with order. So if you want to have order, you must have randomness, and vice versa. Yes?
Did you have this much charisma before you discovered your true nature?
Yes, but it came out in a different way. Yes.
I think there's a sort of danger here, though the riddles are funny, and if you had time enough to think each one through, they'd be very profound. There's a certain danger of everything and everyone being God, because if you've really found yourself as God, then you know that certain things that you as God have created that don't personally affect you, you create for a reason, you say, God, and do-gooder. But if you think you're God, and you try to go into too much social action and change the evils of this world, you end up hurting yourself and a lot of people, and you're playing God and you're not really being God.
Well, I admit to you, my dear, that this is a very, very dangerous conversation. And that I thoroughly agree with, but we didn't come here, did we, to play it safe? All profound ideas and profound questions are dangerous. It is dangerous to go into science. As we all know too well, it is dangerous to go into medicine. Dangerous to go into writing, because the pen is often mightier than the sword. And so I don't think we should withdraw from certain things because they're dangerous. But I entirely agree with you that if I were, as it were, in the spirit of God to go about social reform, I would be failing to realize the construction of my own universe, which is that when you interfere with it, you've got to know exactly how you're interfering. Otherwise, the most amazingly unexpected things will happen. So when people ask for miracles, they don't realize what the miracles involve. I mean, if I turned the microphone into a rabbit, it's altogether possible that you might drop dead, because those events might be connected.
Do you have a study with Carl Jung?
Did I ever study with Carl Jung? I didn't study with him. I knew him, and I read a lot of his writings. Yes.
The notion of watching yourself, watching your work, or being aware of yourself, there's a separation somewhere.
It does in a way, yes. And it depends how you're watching. There's a very interesting thing that comes up in this respect with regard to the Bhagavad Gita and to the Yoga Sutra, where they talk about the witness. There is, as it were, behind our ordinary self with its emotions and involvements, a witness self that does nothing more than perceive what happens. And this is the Atman, or the Purusha, which is not involved. And some of you, no doubt, especially in times of crisis, have suddenly discovered this sort of witness center behind everything that just isn't involved. Most terrible things can be going on, but the witness is impassive. Now, when we go into these states, we've got to be very careful of our descriptive language, because the descriptive language makes the witness seem something apart from what is happening in such a way that if we want to become really sort of skitsy and catatonic about things, we can always be withdrawn and go in and identify ourselves with a solitary and uninvolved witness, who is merely a hangout for the ego, as when the police raid a house in which there are burglars. And the burglars know they'll be caught if they're on the ground floor, so they go up to the first floor. So then the police come up to the first floor, they're up to the second, finally they get to the roof, the open sky and the infinite. And in this way, this was why the Buddha did not teach about the Atman, the real self within us, because he knew people would use the real self as a hideout for the ego. And so, when, say, Krishnamurti tries to explain this, he doesn't talk about the witness. He talks about awareness, and people say to him, but who is aware? What is aware? And he seems a little sticky in his answer here, because what is the matter is that the people asking the question are bewitched by grammar. They are using a language in which it is part of the grammatical convention that the verb always have a noun subject. Now, how on earth do verbs get started by nouns? I ask you. How can a thing start a process? Surely, this is really the same problem Descartes was wrestling with when he tried to find out how spirit could influence matter, or how mind could influence body. Because everybody knows that all proper ghosts walk straight through walls without disturbing the bricks. So how can the ghost in the machine, as Kessler put it, the soul in the body, how can it do anything to the body? There's no connection. Two different realms. The point is, when we're talking about this awareness, what we call thought, feeling, sensation, emotion, we could say in a very clumsy way is it's aware of itself. It's the very nature. There wouldn't be sensation without awareness. You don't have to have something which is aware of it, any more than you have to have a thing called lightning, which does something called flashing. The flashing is the lightning. And so awareness is the one who's aware of it. We say this awareness, if I say I am aware, the word I, as William James suggested, is simply a word of position, like this or here. Awareness here. And your awareness there. Yes, sir? Yes, life is like one great koan. No, death is not the solution. It has no solution. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen. You see, the thing is like this. This is what is hard for Westerners especially to understand. I said, if you understand the yang and the yin, you don't need to ask any further questions. And all you I Ching buffs ought to know this by now. What is not a component of Western common sense is that nothing is something. Now, that may sound a little contradictory, but I think I can explain it. We treat nothingness as if it were ineffective, as if it wasn't really important at all. And yet, when we look out at the night and we see all these stars in space, try and imagine what the heavens would look like if there weren't any space. Then obviously there wouldn't be any stars. I mean, you could think that they would all be jammed together in a lump. There are various objections to that. How would you see the edge of the lump and know it was a lump without space around it? Furthermore, we know when we investigate the constitution of matter physically that at the atomic level there's more space in something than there is anything else. Most of it is empty, which led a physicist at the Argonne lab at the University of Chicago to become a little nutty. He was so impressed with the emptiness of matter that he went around with the most enormous padded slippers in case he should fall through the floor. So now what the point I'm making is this. If space is essential to solid, it's perfectly obvious then that nothing is essential to something. If you can't have something without nothing, it means nothing is pretty powerful stuff. Because something comes out of it. Like that. It's a dogma of Western thought expressed in the Latin phrase ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing comes nothing. But that's not so. Out of nothing comes something. Now you would say, well, if something comes out of nothing, there must be some kind of mystery inside nothing. It must have a secret structure of some kind. I mean, there must be sort of electrical goings on. This is the trouble they have about cosmology. How could this world generate? Could it just be out of free-floating hydrogen? No, it's just a much simpler idea than that. It comes out of real, solid nothing.
It's so simple. You've been listening to Alan Watts in On Being God, delivered in New York City in 1970. This is from the Society series, and to download this and other similar recordings, please visit alanwatts.org. Today's broadcast was brought to you by the Ramdas Be Here Now Podcast Network. Thanks for listening.
Feels like a dream, feels like magic. Now I believe I can have it. Ooh, ooh, taboo. Ooh, ooh, taboo. All of my wishes came true. Shop like a billionaire. Shop like a billionaire. Ooh, ooh, taboo. Ooh, ooh, taboo.
Download the Temu app and shop like a billionaire.
Welcome to the Alan Watts Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Watts, and today we're going to listen to an amazing recording. It was made in 1966 at San Jose State at a talk on drugs, turning the head or turning on. And to put this in perspective, there was a lot going on at that time. The youth was in full revolt, there was a lot of civil unrest, and the use of mind-expanding substances, generally called psychedelics, was in broad use in the counterculture. It was quite a time. And my father was an early pioneer. A few years earlier, in the mid and late 50s, researchers had approached my father, Aldous Huxley, and a few others, asking them to try these substances to see what their reactions would be. I think they figured that a philosopher or an author would have a better ability to communicate and relay the experiences that people were having with these substances. So at first he tried mescaline with one doctor and got what he described as aesthetically pleasing results, but it was not the full-blown experience that he'd heard about. However, another researcher gave him LSD-25, and that produced what he later described as a religious experience. However, by the mid-60s, it was obvious that the street acid that was going around was not quite the same thing as what he'd experienced in the labs, and he was cooling off a bit on this. A few years later, he would come to say that they could be useful tools, but once you got the message, it was good to hang up the phone. And a lot of this had to do with not just the chemicals themselves, but the preparation and approach to them. What was called the set and setting, as many of these people were taking them for primarily recreational purposes, and they were very powerful psychoactive chemicals, so that wasn't always the best approach. So in this talk, he really gets into the whole concept of drugs, and why we call such a wide variety of substances drugs.
Some compare the golem now to ChatGPT.
Revelatory talk with a bit of biographic,
But I'm not going to equate it as something that is, actually creative.
and wide-ranging social commentary on what was going on at the time. I think you'll enjoy this. It's Alan Watts in Drugs, Turning the Head or Turning On.
I suppose that next to the question of racial disturbance,
Direction of nature to
there is
nature
no more controversial
is what it
problem
comes to. It's
among the
absolutely
domestic
necessary
affairs of this country at the present
that
time
we let go.
than drugs. The word drugs has a very funny semantic problem. You might place it on the
Some
drugstore,
compare the golem.
which is perfectly the scene of life in these United States. But at the same time, you have a word drug, as when we say a person is drugged, which means that he is happy, but incompetent, under the influence of heavy medical sedation. We also have another word which should be drugged, I suppose, if we use it in that way, which is called drunk. Because the person, even pleasantly inebriated with alcohol, is just as much drugged as a person might be under the influence of morphine. Are you rendered insensitive and vaguely sleepy? Now, I should explain how I came to be interested in the problem which has now become so controversial of the influence of chemicals on the human mind. For many, many years, more than 30 years, I've been interested in the psychology of religion, pretty much as a disciple of William James, who was really the first outstanding psychologist of religion, tried to understand what is going on when people have religious experiences. And he concentrated, finally and rather particularly, on a certain class of religious experience. There are experiences of visions, which people have revelations. They see Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, Krishna, Buddha, or who have you. But these are, in a certain way, less interesting than the experiences in which the individual has a sudden transformation of his sense of being alive. But these experiences occur sometimes quite spontaneously, to children, to adolescents, or to anyone at almost any time of life. Sometimes they occur as the result of the apparent result of a discipline, as if you practiced yoga, Zen meditation, or a Catholic
Hi everyone, it's David Pulse, the noetic quality of a mystical state. And the term noetic, here you can think about it as a combination of illumination.
Something that we'll have to describe from a number of different points of view. The experience itself is extremely simple. The only thing that is complicated is when we start to try to describe it in language. The experience itself, in its utmost simplicity, was once written down by somebody with nitrous oxide and had a sense of total clarity about all the problems of life. And as he came to our experience, he had his pencil poised over a sheet of paper to write down what was the real nitty-gritty about this. And he wrote it down. He really got the point. Then when he returned to normal consciousness, he looked at what he had written, and he saw that what he had written was everything in this universe is the smell of burnt almonds. Over which the academic community had a good laugh. And said, well, obviously, this was a perfectly frivolous enterprise. But upon mature consideration, everything in this universe is the smell of burnt almonds. That is to say, take any particular experience, such as the smell of burnt almonds, or looking into the eyes of the person you love, or eating a steak, flying an airplane, lying on the beach in the sun, any experience. But there is a way in which that experience implies everything else in the universe. The word implies is probably better than the word is. It's to say you experience, there are certain states of consciousness in which you experience that everything is interconnected. Everything goes with everything else. I knew a woman who got in an accident in an elevator. She hadn't taken any drugs. But in this accident, she was pinned with her leg caught in a mechanism, and she was there for half an hour before anybody could get to her rescue. She was having agonies. But she knew that she simply had to wait. There was nothing to do about it, so she completely accepted her situation. And she said that in that time, she realized, as to put it in her own words, there is not a single grain of dust in this whole universe that is out of place. In other words, that peculiar, painful, unwanted situation was somehow made acceptable and all right because it fitted in to a harmonious arrangement which involved everything that was happening, that had happened, or that ever would happen. And whether you approve of this kind of experience or not, whether you think it's rational or not, it keeps happening. Spontaneously, through discipline, or as a consequence of chemical agencies to thousands of people. And it is, of course, one of the generating forces in the things we call the great religions of the world. Obviously, Jesus Christ had an experience of this kind, which brought him to the feeling that he, as
I knew a little girl
a living organism,
to whom someone gave a bunny rabbit.
what he called in the language of
She was so delighted with the bunny rabbit and so afraid of losing it that taking it home in the car, she squeezed it to death with love.
That was an absolutely unacceptable pronouncement to his contemporaries, and so he got crucified. We are, I hope,
I knew a little girl. Beware of what you become.
and we are, I think, really in need of experiencing the relationship of the individual to the physical world in a way that is more positive, more constructive, more friendly, more close than that which expresses itself in a hostile technology bent on the domination and the conquest of nature, considered as something alien to the human spirit, mechanical, thoughtless, and stupid, that surrounds us as the mere featureless energy behind the galaxies. If indeed it were possible for many of us to have a sensation of not just merely belonging in this world, but being it, if we could feel that our separate individuality is a coming and going expression of what it is that is happening through all the cycles of time and generations of cosmoses, we'd be able to cool it a bit. It might be a very good thing. And that's simply giving an explanation of why I personally have been interested in exploring the psychology and the conditions of this kind of experience for so many years.
In ways that they otherwise just want to work together. That's why I've pointed out
In the
before,
1950s,
and I'll say it again.
a British
I'm sure we quoted to me at some point. The dumbest phrase in military history is our unity is our strength.
Take a dose of mescaline.
No, our shared purpose is our strength. Our shared.
And in the thought that at the time, this was a drug which induced states of consciousness similar to schizophrenia, Humphrey Osborne realized that Aldous Huxley was a marvelous master of words, and therefore it might be a good idea to see if this experience could be described in a wonderfully accurate and beautiful way, exactly what it does. Aldous Huxley didn't simply deliver a private report to the doctors, he rushed into print and published a book called The Doors of Perception. That having taken mescaline gave him an experience which he could not but identify with the great mystical experience of man's integration with the universe, which of course had been known through all history. When I read this as a student of the psychology of religion, I read which he could not but identify with the great mystical experience of man's integration with the universe, which of course had been known through all history. When I read this as a student of the psychology of religion, I was naturally fascinated, but unbelieving.
Your ego
I thought,
has about...
Wallace sometimes goes off the deep end. I knew him very well. And I know he had a kind of enthusiasm for all kinds of novelty. He had foreseen in his novel Brave New World that there might be a way of drugging human beings into sort of perpetual contentment and happiness so that they would give no further trouble to each other. And of course everybody had put this down and said that would be the end of the human spirit. And so I felt maybe this is another of Aldous' weird things, and slightly dismissed it. But then the psychiatrists who had involved him in this finally got in touch with me because they said, you're supposed to be an authority on the psychology of religion, and we'd like to know what you think about drug-induced mysticism. So I was foolish enough at the time to accept an invitation to stand in for Aldous Huxley at a meeting of the American Psychiatric Association in Los Angeles. He couldn't be present, and they asked me to talk about this in his place. I had not at that time experienced any of these drugs, and I simply gave a theoretical talk on the subject and said, if indeed they do produce something like the deepest religious experience, I would imagine that it would be like the sensation of swimming with water wings. That you are kept up by so-called artificial means. You get a notion of how it is to float, but as yet you haven't actually learned how to swim. And you know that magical moment because almost everybody in this room, I presume, knows how to swim. And you remember the magical moment when you suddenly found you could trust yourself to the water and keep afloat. And it was something a little bit beyond, a little bit different than being kept up by a life jacket or water wings. Well, in a way, I still preserve this point of view with regard to the relation of psychedelic chemicals to mysticism. But let me go on with the story of what actually happened. Somewhat later, one of the doctors who had been associated with Aldous Huxley said to me, will you actually try this out and give us your views on it? And it's very nice to be flattered as an authority. And also I was just plain curious. And I'm the sort of person who will try anything once. And so I submitted to being dosed with 100 micrograms of lysergic acid diethylamide number 25, which maybe is not what you call acid. It's a very specific and particular chemical. And I had an extraordinarily interesting experience. But I felt that it was an aesthetic experience, not a mystical experience. And so reported. It was just fascinating, the changes of one's sense perception. It was as if, you know, a gadget called a kaleidoscope, which is a combination of a kaleidoscope and a telescope. You look through this thing, and it models everything you look at in fascinating patterns according to its own inner structure. And I felt that this drug did exactly the same thing as that. That it modified your nervous system in a certain way, like looking through a kaleidoscope telescope instead of a telescope telescope. And just canceled everything out, and that was very interesting, and so on. Then later on, another psychiatrist approached me. He was in San Francisco at Langley Portland, and said, I don't think you've really gone into this deeply enough. I think I could point out certain things to you that would be interesting, because you see, this drug is something that you have to learn how to use, just as you would learn how to use a microscope. There's a certain technique to it. Supposing you're a biologist or a bacteriologist, you've got to learn the art of using the instrument. So I said, okay, let's try it again. I was very skeptical of the whole thing. And lo and behold, I had what I simply could not deny being an experience of cosmic consciousness, the sense of complete, fundamental, total unity forever and ever with the whole universe. And not only that, but that what this thing was fundamentally, despite everything and every kind of appearance in ordinary life to the contrary, that the energy behind the world was ecstatic bliss and love. Well, I was very embarrassed by this, because I thought, gee, you can't get mysticism out of a bottle. That's degrading everything. But yet I couldn't deny the fact that it had happened. So that by this time, Aldous Huxley had rushed into print and had let the cat out of the bag, that this kind of experience was possible through chemicals. At that time, neither he nor I knew that this would become a tremendous popular rage. But I felt that I had a certain responsibility as somebody who knew something about the psychology of religion, and since he'd come out of print, and the idea was getting around that this was possible, I ought to say a few things about it in addition that would induce wisdom, caution, and responsibility about the whole thing. So I recorded this kind of thing in a book called The Joyous Cosmology, to which I appended not only the center part of the book was a description of the experiences that I'd actually had, and then there was a prologue the Decalogue, which were concerned with
The more, therefore, you relinquish power,
that might attend this kind of practice.
The main difference between the teeth in a day process and Nuvia's 24-hour process is
These are things that have assumed almost catastrophic dimensions. But suddenly, in other words, the whole world of young people caught on to this
I ain't seen
and said, let's turn on. Let's have this experience. Then, when Timothy Leary got in here, all caution was thrown to the winds. And he felt that this is something that everybody really owed to himself. Everybody ought to be turned on. Well, I wasn't so sure about that. Because I wouldn't say everybody ought to sail around the world in an open sailboat. You know, it's a great thing if you could do it. But I wouldn't sort of recommend it to anyone. I wouldn't say that everybody ought to spend 3 weeks absolutely alone in a forest to find out who you are. If you can take
clusters of photons and electrons, which produce.
And incidentally, that's the reason I ceased being a minister of religion. I was one for a while, but I found myself in the awkward position of supporting missionaries. Of people who are saying this Christianity is so great that you've all got to have it. And I don't believe that however good a thing there may be in the world, that you should force it on people. You should offer it, yes, you should make it available. You don't shove it down the throat. And always observe the saying of Jesus, which ought to be very embarrassing to the missionaries of Jesus. Give not that which is holy unto dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine. So, I don't want to define in advance who are swine and who are not. But I do think there is to be observed a very great caution in handing out
Clusters of photons and electrons, which produce a pleasant state of
Oysters Rockefeller
to appreciate
because all they want is hamburgers. That's creep. You have to have a certain taste and a certain palate to appreciate things like that. And this is even more true when something you're going to do involves a certain element of danger. And we all saw right away that the use of psychedelic chemicals could be dangerous as well as